The World at War, Part 1. This is the beginning of our lecture about World War I. Roots of the conflict. June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne and future leader of Bosnia, was assassinated by a Slavic nationalist. This event was the catalyst that started World War I, which would last from 1914 to 1918. This is a map of Europe in 1914. The causes of the war. The first cause was nationalism. Nationalism waves were sweeping across Europe in the early 1900s. You had a pan, which means all, pan-German movement led by Germany and Austria, hoping to unite all German-speaking people, all people of German descent. You also had a pan-Slavic movement led by Russia, which hoped to unite all the Slavic people. So the Russians are ethnic Slavs. These movements led to conflicts over territory, much like you're seeing in the Ukraine, with the Russians trying to annex the Slavic people that live in the Crimean Peninsula today. Bosnia was annexed by German-speaking Austria, even though many of its people were Slavs, and this is going to lead to conflict. Number 2, imperialism, establishing political or economic control over other countries. This became a form of international rivalry, and it led to the European powers engaging in an enormous military buildup. And so you had these countries competing for imperial powers. And these imperial powers then, as they developed these colonies, they then needed large militaries to protect them. Number 3, entangling alliances. Nations of Europe formed alliances to maintain a balance of power. Alliances agreed to aid their allies in a crisis. The first alliance is the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, versus the Triple Entente made up of France, Russia, and Great Britain. So, with these two alliance systems, you basically had the major powers of Europe aligned into two camps, and then they would then fight each other. If one of them was attacked, they would come to each other's aid. This is a picture of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife. He was the heir to the Austrian throne and the future leader of Bosnia. His assassination would spark World War I. Chain reaction. Ferdinand, murdered by a Slavic nationalist who thought Bosnia should belong to its neighbor Serbia. This is going to be the event that causes World War I. Austria blamed the Serbian government for the killing and with a pledge of support from Germany declared war on Serbia. Serbia's ally, Russia, mobilized its armies to protect Serbia because they were fellow Slavs. Germany's reaction was to declare war on Russia on August 1, 1914, and 2 days later on Russia's ally, France. A two-front war developed. The first front was the Eastern Front, the front between Germany and Russia, as depicted on this map. The Western Front was on the other side of Germany. Germany hoped to knock out France early and then concentrate on its Eastern Front because it feared Russia more than the rest of Europe. Great Britain had pledged to defend Belgium, so Great Britain enters the war. So to repeat, on the Western Front, Germany hoped to knock out France early and then concentrate on the Eastern Front. Germany invaded neutral Belgium on August 4th on its way to France, hoping to catch the French by surprise. Great Britain had pledged to defend Belgium, so Great Britain enters the war. Opposing the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary were the Allies, France, Russia, and Great Britain. Later, about 20 other countries would join the Allies, while Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire, which is present-day Turkey, would join the Central Powers. Stalemate in the trenches. Both sides thought the war would be brief. From the North Sea south for 400 miles to Switzerland, Allied soldiers dug trenches to live in and to fight. This is a picture of a diagram of trench warfare. German soldiers did the same. Trenches were so close at times that soldiers could hear the enemy talking. Trench warfare caused a bloody stalemate that would last almost 4 years. Most fighting occurred at night. One side would blast the other with heavy artillery, then send its soldiers out of the trenches with bayonets fixed on rifles to attack the enemy's trenches. Most were cut down by machine gun fire. For example, during 1 week in 1915, Allies gained about 1,200 yards of territory at the cost of 17,000 men. Life in the trenches was very hard. This section is not in your notes, but I wanted to show you some pictures from the period. You can see the trenches were basically mud. Sometimes the walls were reinforced with a little bit of wood to prevent erosion. They often were filled with water after rain, so it was very difficult to stay dry. They were infested with rats and lice. Here you can see soldiers with rats that they've caught in the trenches. Imagine that size of rat, many of them, going after your food in the trench. You're sleeping in the trench, they're running around. It was really not pleasant conditions. This is another view of soldiers in trenches getting ready to fight in a forward trench. This final picture of life in the trenches shows some of what I was talking about with the wood. There's a little bit of metal there. They're trying to prevent some erosion, give them a place to sit, keep their feet dry. You see the water on the ground. So they would live here. They would wipe themselves off the best they could here. They wouldn't have showers, of course. They would use the latrine in these trenches. They would eat in these trenches. It was a very rudimentary and crude existence. Life in the trenches was very, very hard. New instruments of death. Generals clung to obsolete battlefield tactics. An example, the old tactic of charging enemy lines was worthless against machine guns and heavy artillery. Germans also used poison gas as an attempt to break the stalemate in 1915. The British introduced tanks, like this one, to smash barbed wire and to clear the way for infantry, but the tanks proved unreliable. They would often slip a track and get stuck out in no man's land. Airplanes were used. Aerial dogfights with enemy planes occurred over the trenches. The German ace, the Red Baron, won 80 victories before he was shot down. War also occurred at sea. Germans introduced their submarine, which they called a U-boat. They attacked without warning, sinking both military and commercial warships. This is a picture of a German U-boat. And this is an interior diagram of a German U-boat. So U-boat for underwater boat, basically. And these U-boats were the first submarines. I mean, we know there were a couple of very crude submarines used during the Civil War era in the United States. But here you have the first really powered, with something other than manpower, powered underwater submarine. And they were very, very effective and very deadly. This is a map showing the 1914 naval blockade by Great Britain of Germany. British set up a naval blockade to cut off supplies bound for Germany. Germany used submarines to retaliate. They used their U-boats. Britain depended on imported food, so German submarines began to attack merchant ships in an attempt to starve the British. February 1915, Germany declared a war zone around the British Isles. German subs during this time destroyed 1/4 of the British fleet. Submarines then threatened American trade. President Wilson had declared the U.S. a neutral country at the beginning of the war. Under international law, warships were to warn neutral ships before attack and then take on surviving passengers. The problem with this was that submarines could do neither. As a neutral nation, the U.S. sold food, arms, and ammunition to both sides, but because of the British blockade, most of its trade was with the Allies. German subs threatened this trade and violated the rights of neutral nations. President Wilson's response to Germany's naval war zone was that they would be held to strict accountability for any loss of American life or property. This concludes part 1 of the World War I lecture.